and thanks to ODI and CALP for organising this event. I'm going to present the key findings from the research, and I'm going to focus most of the time on the constraints to wider adoption of technology that were identified, along with suggestions for how to overcome these constraints. And you're going to have to forgive me if I go a bit like a freight train. There's a lot to get to, and I only have 25 minutes. I'll just start with a bit of the background to the research. The humanitarian sector engages with most often the poorest people in what can be challenging environments. And so a reliance on technology was considered until recently to be perhaps an additional burden rather than a tool for improving programme effectiveness. And recent advances in technology in low-income countries has led to more of an interest from donors, practitioners and governments in how technology can better serve humanitarian response. So one of the areas of humanitarian programming that's arguably been driving this change is the field of cash and voucher programming. And this is because advances in technological capacity, especially around electronic payment systems, has been a critical factor in enabling a broader consideration of the use of cash over in-kind distributions during emergencies. So just a brief introduction to the research objectives. CALP commissioned Concern in partnership with Oxford Policy Management to undertake a review of the current use of new technology in humanitarian aid applied to cash programming. They wanted to encompass every stage of the programme cycle, so a large part of what we've done is focusing on electronic payment systems, but we've also looked at technology in terms of targeting, registration, monitoring and evaluation. And within this, we've aimed to highlight any evidence of cost effectiveness of using the new technology, bottlenecks and barriers to upscale, and also possible next steps in overcoming these barriers to adopt technology to enhance aid provision. And this just gives you a bit more information on sort of the research parameters and methods. A bit on the context, we've focused on low-income and disaster-affected countries that are experiencing humanitarian crisis in the last 5 years. We've aimed to incorporate slow onset, rapid onset emergencies, conflict scenarios, and also early recovery contexts. And we look to include lessons in other contexts where appropriate. So we've looked at, for example, electronic delivery systems in longer-term social protection programs, such as the Hunger Safety Nets program in Kenya. And also technology in broader humanitarian and disaster response with a focus on Haiti. Summary of the activities, a literature review and stakeholder mapping, and this followed by interviews with over 100 key stakeholders from a variety of sectors. And there was really an incredibly positive response from people. I mean, it's clearly an area of interest for many. As a result, the research quickly went from this to this. So given the short time available, I'm going to generalise findings across the different technology groups to a certain extent. And as Paul said, you can go to the CALP website for more detail on the report. There's also a separate executive summary for the faint-hearted. It's fairly long. So first of all, if we just look at the electronic or e-payment systems that were identified during the research, there were 4 different systems that were identified. So prepaid debit cards, the standard debit card you have in your wallet, a smart card, a card with a chip, mobile money transfer, and then also a relatively new tool, the delivery and redemption of electronic vouchers through the mobile phone. So to date, these have been used in over 25 programs in 17 countries. Mobile money was the tool most commonly used, so this included 6 international NGOs in Haiti that piloted mobile money in the early recovery phase after the earthquake. So it's no longer just a case of M-Pesa in Kenya, and it's also been used, as you can see, in a variety of different contexts. Just to give you a bit of information, the ones in bold indicate Pakistan is where a government was the lead agency rather than an NGO. That's the flood response. And in Kenya, where it wasn't an emergency program, so that was the Hunger Safety Nets program that I mentioned before. So these two are also programs with the greatest scale in the use of technology, so perhaps there's a lesson there for political leverage of governments. In terms of the other technology solutions that were identified, I'll just run through these briefly. Mobile communication, so that's sort of text and voice-based tools to relay information to disaster-affected people and to get feedback from them in complaints response mechanisms. And again, we saw Haiti and the earthquake response proved to be a testing ground for innovation in this sense. This is because of the scale of mobile phone ownership in Haiti, and also the fact that network operators got systems back up and running relatively quickly following the disaster. Digital data gathering, so this is your collection of survey data through the mobile phone or through a PDA, a handheld device, and upload to a data management system. We actually included experiences from 4 non-emergency programs not related to cash programming in this sense, because the lessons were still relevant. We looked at some data management tools, so tools for improving household registration and the management of household data. So this included things like programs that had utilized fingerprint recognition biometric technology. It included LMMS, the beneficiary management system that some of us were involved in a demonstration of this morning, and also some cloud-based data management systems on programs in Niger, Syria, Haiti, and Somalia. And finally, crisis mapping, again, Haiti. So after the earthquake, there was an increased use of digital media technologies to manage humanitarian information. And this was really from a coming together of the technology community, universities, and aid organisations. The most well known is probably the Ushahidi Haiti project. This was a volunteer-driven effort to produce an open crowdsourced map to support effective aid response. So this is where information from sources on the ground was geo-coordinated to build an electronic map. And then another example, the Digicel phone network was used by some researchers at the Karolinska Institute to map population movement based on location data from 2 million handsets. And that data was then used to target aid supplies to specific locations. So I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I just want to talk briefly through the ones that are highlighted in red. This is a table highlighting the benefits experienced to date from using 3 of those technologies, so electronic payment systems, mobile communications, digital data gathering. And the columns on the right show you that many of the experiences are common to all 3 technologies. And this is going to be available online, and I'm not going to go through everything, but there's a couple that are worth highlighting in more detail. So in terms of transparency, the use of electronic payment systems increases visibility of who is receiving what, and in some cases also how that money is used. Mobile communication, it was proven to improve the effectiveness of communicating information to recipients of aid programs. It also allows for a 2-way dialogue with your beneficiaries. And finally, digital data gathering increased the accuracy of the data that was collected using these tools. There's some examples of cost savings over time. So Tufts University provides a direct comparison of costs of the manual method versus mobile money transfer on Concern's cash transfer program in Niger. And the recurring costs for the manual cash distribution were reduced by 30% with mobile money. So you can appreciate over time you're going to get some cost efficiencies. And there's time savings involved as well. So with digital data gathering, there's significant efficiency gains to be made relative to manual approaches. This is because the tools remove the need for the entire stage of data entry to the database, and also because they improve accuracy. There's less need to go back and make changes. And in terms of benefits to the recipients, again, from Niger, there's evidence of reduced opportunity costs of accessing mobile money versus manual. And this is an equivalent to the time to generate an agricultural wage for 2.5 to 3 kilos of millet, which you can appreciate in a context of food insecurity is fairly significant. The challenges. It wasn't all perfect. Again, I'm just going to highlight a couple of these to talk through in more detail. They're kind of the other side, the flip side, if you like, from what I've just mentioned in terms of benefits. In terms of accountability, a focus of aid agencies on using these technologies for improving accountability upwards to donors could potentially be at the expense of accountability downwards to recipients. The research highlighted several programs where the technology is enabling agencies to limit expenditure choices of recipients to a limited number of approved commodities at the point of sale. And the reason given in the interviews for this was to ensure that the money was spent as donors intended, because it was a food security program. But there's been a huge shift towards the use of unconditional cash in emergencies on the basis of the dignity, the choice, the flexibility that this offers households. And this, to me, seems to be a step back towards prescriptive aid, which would seem to be a step backwards. In terms of setup costs, the initial investment in the hardware and the software and the training can mean that the initial setup cost for these solutions is significantly higher, not always, but often, than their more traditional manual alternative. And the setup also takes time. So there were examples of problems that were encountered when agencies sought to undertake all the preparation that they needed to do to identify the tool, to set up the tool, to train staff in the tool after an emergency is hit. And this led to selection of tools which were not the best suited to the context. And then an important one on data protection and privacy from the point of view of the recipients. The use of the technology, the electronic payment systems, provides a high degree of oversight on the part of agencies regarding such things as purchasing behaviour. And in some cases, this went as far as visibility of account details. So you could consider that this is an invasion of people's personal privacy. And in fact, when we had interviews with service providers of branchless banking, it was agreed by them that this information should only be given if there's been prior informed consent on the part of the beneficiaries. I'm just going to scoot really quickly through this slide. It's fairly self-explanatory. Experiences overall have been very positive, even taking into account some of the difficulties that were raised on the previous slide. People want it, and that's the bottom line. You know, beneficiaries that have been exposed to some of these technologies have been in favour, have been excited of the opportunities that they can provide. And in terms of factors key to success, the one I'm going to point out to you is the on-the-ground support. You know, the introduction of technology doesn't need to change everything that we're doing. And an important lesson is that it doesn't do away, and it shouldn't do away with the face-to-face contact. That's a very important part of humanitarian interventions. So this is the bit I want to spend a bit of time on, the constraints. So these tools are clearly beneficial, but they can't be considered to be being used at the moment at any particular large scale. And they're not being systematically adopted by any aid agency. And so the research identified various barriers to more widespread, more systematic adoption of these tools in cash programs and in aid programs more generally. And these can be grouped under 7 themes. The first one says technological, the second one says financial, and the third one says institutional. So the technological barriers relate to limitations of the technology environment. So for example, branchless banking services are still yet to penetrate many areas. This is linked to the low penetration of network coverage in low-income countries, which most of the solutions depend on to a higher or lesser degree. Financial constraints, these are barriers to do with the costs we've just mentioned. The above issue of coverage is linked to a financial constraint. So in many countries, development of the underlying network infrastructure that's required for these solutions is solely the responsibility of the private sector. And this leads to a lack of business case to justify expansion into more remote, less populated areas. And this is where, arguably, a large proportion of the poorest and those affected by disasters can be said to live. This is also an issue in-house, affecting investment decisions of aid agencies. So the high setup costs relative to manual approaches, along with the short-term time horizons of humanitarian funding, means that aid agencies tend to focus on the cost and the efficiency of the immediate programme, rather than any consideration of longer-term benefits that such an investment has potential to realise. And another factor linking to this is a lack of evidence, really, to show that the additional benefits make the investments in technology worthwhile. So we weren't able to find many concrete examples of cost efficiency studies or cost benefit analysis of new technology in humanitarian programming. In terms of the institutional barriers, these are really barriers that relate to capacities of stakeholders. So there's a lack of agency knowledge of the options available, and this is increased by the fact that this is a rapidly changing marketplace. So I'll give you the example of Kenya. You know, we've all heard of Safaricom in Kenya with mobile money, but there's currently 4 mobile network operators providing mobile money services. Their agent network capacity, their tariff structures, their products, their operating model are not the same. And it takes resources to assess all of these options and make decisions. And aid agencies' investigations of new technology are happening in isolation. So there's a lack of information sharing and there's a lack of informed debate. again, I'll just name these because the words haven't come up. So the top one is operational constraints, attitudinal constraints, political constraints, and then finally sort of regulatory, legislative. In terms of operational, straightforward, it's the time required for the initial scoping and the establishment of the systems. And this presents a challenge in emergency response where time is clearly going to be a critical factor. So after an emergency, it's too late to be deciding or planning to do this for the first time. Attitudinal constraints. Agencies generally acknowledged a tendency to be risk averse. They talked about the pilot mentality of using new technology. Interviews highlighted that some agencies' assumption of technology is that it's expensive or it's difficult to use. This, combined with perhaps a lack of full understanding of what the benefits are, can lead to the attitude of, well, we've always done this way, so why would we change? And this was also given as an explanation for why solutions haven't been more systematically adopted within an agency. So perhaps senior management in a head office haven't been exposed to the benefits, and that this creates difficulty with program staff in a particular country or a particular context who have piloted this technology, trying to persuade further investment. Political constraints. One really important one is the lack of sharing or the collaborative ways of working between agencies around use of new technology. So this is because of perhaps a kudos. Technology innovation can bring a certain credibility to agencies that are seeking to gain an advantage in the competition for funding. It was also suggested that donors can add to this problem with a focus on funding innovation. And this lack of collaboration leads to what's known as the first mover problem. So agencies are all expressing an interest in new technology, but there's generally a tendency to sort of, let's say, sit on the fence. People are happy to observe, to watch, to let others take the risk at being the first to try something. And this lack of common action, and perhaps maybe in part a desire to maintain control, is a factor behind the development of customised in-house solutions, of which we identified a couple. So you can imagine that if you've invested considerably in a tool in-house, this might lead to an inhibition of wider sharing of the custom-built solution. And it can also result in systems which essentially have the same function being developed over and over within agencies. A relevant example came from Haiti, where we were told that a number of stakeholders had created independent new sites and applications to organise missing persons information. And all that did was make several redundant, and also it potentially was confusing to the stakeholders that were supposed to benefit from these tools. In terms of concerns about data protection issues, again, I think this is one of the most important lessons that came out of the research. There's concerns being raised regarding the risks associated with electronic storage and management of information, of confidential beneficiary data, especially in contexts where there's a protection concern and perhaps a perceived risk of repercussions if data was to fall into the wrong hands. So the move to electronic data, it's highlighting a lack of a protocol for data management in our sector in general. And it's the same for data collected and stored on paper, but it's considered more of a risk when it's in electronic form, as it's potentially easier to move or to access. And then this links to the regulatory barrier. So there's a lack of clear national policies or humanitarian standards on data protection. And there were also concerns raised by those interviewed as to whether governments or donors could lay proprietary claim to databases of aid agencies. So what can we do? The barriers that have been identified, they currently limit the efficiency and the effectiveness of these solutions in large areas where we're working, where there's a need for humanitarian response. But they're not insurmountable. The report recommends actions are needed in 3 areas. One is to improve the technological environment. One is to increase capacity of stakeholders. And then the final one is to develop and formalise new ways of working. And I'm just going to go through a couple of these points in more detail. In terms of improving the technology environment, there are going to be continued advances in technology over the coming years. This probably will mean that some of the limitations that we're currently seeing in the technology environment will diminish over time. But as a sector, we could take a more proactive role in seeking to overcome these barriers more rapidly, especially in countries where we know, with relative certainty that there's a high predictability of a future emergency, a future need for a cash transfer program. So one thing we could be doing more of is proactive approaches to service providers. There were experiences of Save the Children in Zimbabwe, of Concern in Niger, and some others that showed that proactive approaches to electronic payment service providers in emerging markets can inform development of their branchless banking services to where they're needed for aid intervention. And we could be doing more of this in terms of access to branchless banking services, but also in terms of the actual network provision itself. By aggregating demand, by working together and approaching this, the service providers with a collective need rather than separately as it is at the moment, the service requirements of humanitarian stakeholders are going to be fairly substantial in a number of countries, and we'd be likely to be in a better position to influence the development of the technological environment this way. And another area that came up again and again, especially when talking to the private sector, surprisingly enough, was the cost-sharing arrangements to improve connectivity. So in areas prone to crisis, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that some sort of cost-sharing arrangement could be entered into between perhaps the donor community and a network operator in order to overcome that barrier that I mentioned of the initial cost of investment. And there are some low-cost network options becoming available now. I can give you an example which I just thought was quite amazing. There's a company called AltaBridge. They're a NetHope member, and they've developed like a micro base station to bring connectivity to smaller communities. I think it was in Indonesia the first time round. And that significantly reduced setup costs. So their base station costs $3,000 instead of $120,000. I mean, that's a massive decrease, which means that setting up a site cost, it's 50 grand rather than 200 grand. And it also becomes much more profitable in a much shorter time. And you can imagine that if those costs were split between several agencies rather than just expecting the private sector to invest that on the hope that perhaps they're going to see some returns, might be the way to go. If this works, it is. This is just an example of what I'm talking about. You can imagine that, if we're looking at cost sharing between 2, 3, 4 organisations, it becomes much more manageable. And also, you're going to improve coordination and efficiencies that way as well. In terms of capacity building, I'm not just looking at capacity building within NGOs. So more could be done to increase the familiarity of staff with the technology solutions, before an emergency hits. This could be done through things such as practical training, like the LMMS demonstration we had this morning, perhaps in conjunction with a service provider. It could also be done by encouraging use of these systems in everyday work, and that includes things like electronic payment systems for staff salaries and what have you. In terms of the recipients of aid programs, it would be good to invest more in activities which build recipients' capacity to make greater use, more longer-term use of mobile technology and branchless banking rather than just in an emergency. And this might require improving linkages between humanitarian and development programming and longer-term funding horizons, and I'll come back to that in a second. And in terms of service providers, the research highlighted the potential role that as a sector we can play in increasing the capacity of service providers to better support humanitarian response. So in Haiti, USAID gave a grant to Mercy Corps, which enabled them to trial one of the mobile network operators' emerging payment platforms to vet it for humanitarian needs, and also to support their agent network development. And another way that we could be supporting, building up the capacity of branchless banking networks is by using branchless banking for other payments besides emergency cash transfers, for other sort of logistical needs. And finally, new ways of working. I'm just going to highlight another couple of these. The first one I wanted to bring to attention was the idea of incentive structures. So again in Haiti, USAID and Gates Foundation created an incentive structure for the private sector after the earthquake. And this was to support the development and rollout of mobile money. It was called the First to Market Prize, and 2 mobile network operators responded, and this resulted in 6 international NGOs being able to utilise mobile money to deliver their cash transfers in a relatively insecure environment. And it wasn't all perfect, but it does show that there is real potential for incentivising the private sector to develop relevant tools and for creating healthy competition in the marketplace for our ends. And companies that are willing to go the last mile in developing, services that are accessible to the poorest, should be able to receive some support. And there's various donors sort of working at the cutting edge of this, and I would say they have a role to play in sharing lessons, not just the positive but also the negative, and perhaps bringing other donors to the table. It was also suggested that donor funding directed towards implementing partners could support wider adoption of technology by perhaps being linked to either incentives or conditions related to sharing of information and systems to avoid this first mover problem. These would need to be carefully considered, and they would need to be sensitively applied and not just bulldozed, but there is real potential there. And then contingency planning and preparedness frameworks. As I said before, there's a key lesson from this research is that after an emergency has been declared is not the right time to be considering use of new technology for the first time. It requires assessment of all your options, negotiations, fairly extensive due diligence sometimes, and this should all be part of your contingency planning. And ideally, this should be undertaken as joint action to realise economies of scale. And several organisations suggested that the ideal would be to develop in a place where with fairly high degree of certainty that there's going to be perhaps even an annual need for some sort of intervention. Develop a procedural framework for preparedness between all the parties. So you could have memorandums that would set realistic targets for how long things would take, how long they're going to take to get off the ground, what can be expected, taking into account everybody's capacity, perhaps establish standard tariffs for the humanitarian sector for using a service, establish a senior focal point of contact within the service provider, not just a sales rep. And in disaster-prone countries with well-established branchless banking partners, it could even include some sort of commitment to provide, let's say, temporary agents or temporary liquidity to where it might be needed. In terms of protocols, one of the things that was identified was a protocol for data management, something similar to a code of conduct, similar to Sphere standards, that could help to overcome some of the concerns in terms of electronic storage use and sharing of data. And this would need to take into account, country regulations if they exist, but it would set a minimum standard in countries where regulations are weak, and it would provide clarity to everyone. It was noted that any rules would need to enable aid agencies to still operate efficiently. I'm not suggesting that they should get in the way of people going about their job. And then the final thing that came up in terms of new ways of working was bringing the developmental into the humanitarian context. And this was a recommendation of the HER review, and there are advantages to this from the point of view of advancing use of technology for humanitarian cash transfers. So it would better enable cost efficiencies to be realised from the initial investment in the technology, and it would also better enable the inclusion of any after support that was required to ensure that people can utilise branchless banking more effectively over long-term periods. If they're introduced to it for the first time in a humanitarian initiative, they could actually fully understand and get to grips and then continue to use it in the longer term. And this graph just highlights this in a little bit more detail. So you've got your, your sort of current emergency funding horizon, and then you've got what we're proposing, a longer term funding horizon. And you see that this allows the cost efficiencies over time to counteract the higher setup costs of the technological solution, and actually realise the cost effectiveness of the technology versus manual approaches. So, in conclusion, technology is a tool like any other. It shouldn't replace all the traditional ways of programming. It should be complementing program processes. But in my opinion, it's brilliant, and these barriers can be overcome. It's just a matter of finding different ways to work together and involve new stakeholders, especially the private sector. That's the thing that came out most strongly for me. Thank you for your time.